The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Welcome back, folks. I hope you had a good lunch. Good, thank you. Before we proceed with the publication of People's Exhibit P-TR-1011, I want to remind you that the defendant's statements on this video recording have been admitted only for a limited purpose. You may consider the defendant's statements on this video recording only as to the issues raised by his plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider them for any other purpose. Dr. Reed's statements on this video, whether as part of questions, reactions, or responses, may only be considered for the limited purpose of allowing you to assess the reliability of his examination and to provide context to the statements made in the video recording by the defendant. You shall not consider any statements made by Dr. Reed on this video recording for any other purpose, including for the truth of their content or as evidence of their content. With that, Mr. Brockler, you may proceed with playing Exhibit P-TR-1011. I'm going to dim the lights.
In the same conversation, you said, I increased my self-worth and I didn't have to die. Then I said, do you feel that value 12 times more than you had before? You said, theoretically, yes. I said, theoretically? How about really feeling 12 times more? Let me ask you that again. Is it a theoretical feeling or a real feeling that you're...
It's abstract.
It's abstract, okay. And I think at another point you said it was incremental, not a huge leap, but an incremental abstraction. You said then, when I said theoretically, how about really? You said, well, it's only theoretical in nature. The concept is theoretical, and you just used the word abstract.
Right.
And my note here is that you felt, and continue to feel, that it was morally okay to kill for the theoretical possibility, not a for sure thing or not a real thing, but for the abstract possibility, to use your word just now, of feeling a bit better.
Are you saying it should have been really instead?
Well, not that it should have been, because I guess it is what it is. On the one hand, one might think of somebody who says, if I kill these people, I am going to feel better, 12 times better, or some increment better. And that would be one reason for killing them. That would have one, let me say, way of looking at it more. It seems to me different to think of it as, if I kill them, then in some abstract, theoretical way, I believe I'll feel better.
Right, one's a thought and the other is, it will be better.
Okay. From what you said back at the hospital, it was a theoretical thing, a thought.
Yeah.
Is that generally correct, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. A theoretical thing, a thought, an abstraction.
Right.
Let me ask you again today, are there ways that you really feel better or believe you're better, or does it remain an abstraction, a theoretical matter?
It's still a thought, yeah, abstraction.
Oh, thank you. We talked about lying and telling the truth back at Senate. And we were talking about, you're talking with Fenton, I think. Fenton and Feinstein. Speaking truthfully and deflecting incriminating questions. And that's, I think, what you said in your notebook.
Right.
About what you had done there. You wanted to keep your plan secret, you said. But at the same time, speak truthfully, you said, right, because I'm not a liar.
Most of the time, at least.
Sorry?
Most of the time. Everybody lies sometimes.
What's the worst lie that you ever told me? The most lie.
Probably the lie of omission of not saying I was going to go shoot people.
You just said the lie of omission. Is a lie of omission?
I just don't consider it a true lie, but
Okay.
it's kind of in that lying category.
And that's exactly where I was going. I wanted to talk about that a little more. And indeed, you said, I asked you about lying by omission, and you said, I don't consider that a true lie. Okay, so it's quite consistent with what I said earlier. But it sounds like from what you just said, you leave the possibility or the fact that it's a form of lie.
Right, it's even got lie in the...
Leaving out something important. And indeed, it's when I said, what's your biggest lie, you picked a, quote, lie of omission.
Right.
You talked about being called the Joker here in jail, and we may have talked about that briefly yesterday as well.
Yeah.
When again is the first time you recall people talking or calling you the Joker?
Well, early on and after I was arrested.
They still do that?
Sometimes.
Can you describe to me a time or a situation in which you've heard them or noticed them referring to you as a Joker?
No, not really.
Has there been a time when you actually did hear them say that, or do you kind of assume that's what they're calling you?
No, I've actually heard them say it.
Can you describe an instance or two of when you actually heard?
Well, they were in a cell kind of adjacent or near my cell, and they kind of just yelling, the Joker.
Were you pretty sure they were referring to you?
Yeah, because they said, like, James the Joker.
I guess it's not a secret that you're in the jail.
Right.
Is it your impression that the other inmates know that you're here, especially if they've been here a while?
Yeah.
Is it your impression that they would recognize you if they saw you?
That I'm not sure, unless they've like, seen me on TV or something.
You look a little different than the way you looked on TV.
Right, I've got a beard, because the shavers don't work here.
And the hair is grown back. The hair's different color.
Yep.
Do you ever call yourself the Joker? Refer to yourself as the Joker?
No, I don't.
Even in private thoughts or private fantasies?
I can see why people would call you the Joker, though. The dyed hair and the setting, the movie being the Batman movie.
Once again, do you ever, even in private fantasy, refer to yourself as the Joker? Hey, I'm the Joker, or a nickname that you accept for yourself, not just something other people accept, even in private?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I ask you what Dr. Fenton or Dr. Feinstein might tell me when I talk with them, and I've talked with them. One of the things you said you thought they would tell me is that they took you very seriously, and that they had even called the beta threat response team or something like that.
I learned about that through my lawyers.
Is there any part of these events, any part of these events, that has to do with James Holmes being taken seriously?
I don't think so, no. I think people took me seriously.
Before the event?
In therapy.
You had a photograph that you believe would influence the way people remembered you and the way people thought of you based on photographs. A notebook that would influence the way people thought of you based on what you wrote. I'm wondering about whether part of this, not all of it, has to do with a guy who wants people to take him seriously.
No, I felt I was taken seriously before the shooting.
In what way?
And I was a serious student.
And I agree that no one has suggested to me that you're not a serious student. No one has suggested that you were a trivial person.
Right.
Sometimes people who are not trivial at all believe or feel that they're trivial and not taken seriously. Can you think of any times when that might have described you, feeling that you weren't being taken seriously, or people didn't recognize you and value you enough?
I think that's different from being taken seriously. But
Go down either path. I'm all ears. I'd like to hear.
well, for the value, there wasn't anybody who tried to get me to stay in the neuroscience program.
There wasn't anybody who tried to get you to stay, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I told my advisor I wanted to leave, and he didn't say no, you should stay or something.
Would have been nice if he'd said, no, you should stay.
Yeah.
You could have still decided one way or the other, but it would have been nice for him to want you to stay. Is that the idea?
Right. Yeah.
Roughly when did you have that conversation with him?
A couple days after I dropped out.
Okay. So that would have been a couple of days, or several days after the prelims.
Yeah, a couple couple days after the treatment.
Did he suggest retaking them, or?
No, I felt like I could have asked him to retake it, but I didn't.
But nobody volunteered.
Right.
You can retake.
Nobody did, no.
How'd you feel?
I guess undervalued.
What else did you feel that they thought about you or might think about you at that time? When he's saying that, or maybe other people are not valuing you?
I don't know about other people, but it would have been nice if he said.
Has something like that ever happened before in your life? That it would have been nice for someone to encourage you or appreciate you, offer you something?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
Think about it for a minute. Other times, in school or not in school, young or older.
Nothing's coming to me.
How about when the family decided to move back to San Diego? And I think you mentioned that they either didn't ask you or didn't pay any attention to your not wanting to move.
I think they paid attention and they told me why I was moving, so it wasn't a value issue.
Okay. And that was just something that popped into my head. It doesn't have to be,
Right.
it doesn't have to be Freudianly significant or something.
Okay.
So that was one path, the being valued. How about the other path?
What's the other path?
The other, you had said, now you're going to test my memory. You had said, wasn't being remembered, was slightly different from being valued. Taken seriously.
Oh,
Taken
yes.
seriously.
Okay.
That's what it was. Anything else come to mind about not being taken seriously or being taken seriously?
No, nothing really.
Before the shootings occurred, before you went back into the theater to begin the shooting, that was a point at which you thought the FBI would then come and arrest you, right?
Right, because it was in the act.
In the act of it. I'm not sure I ever asked you how likely you thought that was at the time.
I don't think I've analyzed it like that.
Can you think now about the way you felt then, and it may be difficult to put yourself back then? Did you think it was, they're going to be here any time, and you were surprised they didn't stop you? Or it was a fleeting thought of, maybe they'll stop me, or what were the chances, I guess I'm asking?
I believe they could stop me, but I didn't think it was probable.
Where along the probability line, you didn't think it was probable?
Maybe like 20% chance they would stop me.
Okay. Were you surprised that they didn't stop you?
A little bit, yeah.
At what point, if you remember, did you say to yourself, I guess they're not going to stop me?
Before I went in the door, I was back in again.
And I think you said something like at that point, it's really going to happen.
Yeah.
Or you may have said that, and maybe you thought it twice, after the call to the hotline was not answered. Or was cut off or something like that.
Sometime in that, getting out of the car period.
And those all happened within a minute or two of each other.
Yeah, they're very close together.
You mentioned that you didn't say anything as you were shooting. Didn't yell things out or anything like that.
No,
Are you quite sure of that?
I'm like 100% sure.
So that you've said several times that you were sort of on autopilot.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying that there's no chance that the autopilot would have blotted out your words or screams or yells or something?
Well, in my conscious recollection, I know for sure that I did.
Because we know that there are certain things that you were aware of, even though you describe yourself as being an autopilot. You were aware that the gun jammed. You were aware of going to the lighted area. You were aware of trying to fix it. You were aware of certain people moving around.
Right.
You were aware of the guy who smiled.
Yep.
And then at some point, before the guy who smiled, you were aware that you were done.
Yep.
I've always been a little curious about the scratches you say were in the gas mask that were interfering with seeing things.
Yeah, I bought a cleaner for it, but it didn't.
I'm sorry?
I bought a cleaner, a lens cleaner, but it didn't work.
Was it a new or used?
It was a new mask, but it came kind of scratched a little bit.
Scratches that are up close to the eye don't generally interfere with seeing things far away. Let me give you an example, because you're a guy that has worn glasses, and I'm a guy that wears glasses.
Yeah.
Okay. When your glasses are a little dirty, somebody else may say, oh, your glasses are dirty, but you can still see pretty darn well through
I
the
could
glasses.
still see with the gas mask on,
Okay.
but because it was darker inside than outside, it was hard to focus. And
Okay. You had the gas mask on before you went back in.
right.
You could see to open the door, things like that, to get back.
Yeah, so it was only a partial obstruction.
Okay. Let me come back for just a minute to the way you might have wanted to be remembered. And I'm not talking so much about now, but the way you believe you wanted to be remembered at the time of the shootings or just before the shootings. Can you talk a little more about that to me?
I just wanted to be remembered visually by like on a picture.
Which picture?
Any of the ones that were on my phone.
One of the ones, or a couple of the ones, were headshots of you with a sort of, not sure how to interpret it, devilish or impish or whimsical look, looking at the incendiary with the fuse, holding the gun, things like that. Another one was of, I'm trying to remember, it wasn't
coat and the vest.
Okay. So which is the one that conveys, if it is just one, which is the one that conveys the way that James wanted to be remembered, the James before the shooting?
I think the most powerful image was the one where I was holding a gun in front of my face.
Holding the gun in front of your face?
Yeah.
And that would convey to somebody 5 years from now what?
Just that they would remember the picture, and that was James Holmes.
That was James Holmes. And what was James Holmes? In that?
They don't need to remember what that, or
I'm sorry?
they don't need to remember anything extra. Just have a memory of the face.
I'm not sure I understand. They don't need to remember anything extra.
Yeah, all they need to remember is that's what James Holmes looked like.
Okay. So having people remember what you look like, not forget your face in a sense. But there's a certain attitude to that picture.
Yeah.
I want them to remember that attitude as well.
They don't have to.
But I mean, that was the one you picked of the various pictures that had slightly different attitudes. All of them had some of the equipment in them.
I guess if they want to remember that attitude, they can.
You're not saying that they would remember the picture of you with the poster of the woman behind you.
I don't think that was as powerful an image as the other one to remember.
Powerful. You're not saying they would remember the picture of you on the hike.
Right.
Because
it's not as strong an image. It's not something memorable.
that's something
It's not something as memorable as the one that they got.
as venerable.
Or memorable.
Memorable, okay. Okay. That's a strong guy in the picture. Are you a pretty strong guy?
Average.
At the time that you took the pictures, did you believe you were a pretty strong guy?
Yeah, I think so.
Let me spin out a couple of thoughts. One is, I'm a strong guy, and that's why I'm taking this picture of me as a strong guy. That I want people to remember me as a strong guy. Another line of thought would be, I'm not such a strong guy, but I can make them think I was a strong guy and make them remember me as a strong guy. If I
don't
take
think that
this
was the
picture.
case.
Sorry?
I don't think that was the
I don't think that was it. Why would they remember your face anyway?
because it's unusual to have dyed hair like that and contact lenses like that. You're more likely to remember something unusual than something mundane.
The elephant in the room, of course, is the shooting as the thing that they will remember and attach the picture to the shooting.
Right, so at least they have some memory of who I am.
Because I can't particularly think of a picture of a guy holding a gun 5 years ago unless I attach it to some other event that
To make it make sense.
makes me remember it. Okay. Okay. So my mind goes to, it was a strong guy that killed these people. The picture of the guy that killed these people indicates he was a strong guy.
It's not inaccurate.
Is it accurate?
Sure. Yeah.
Those are the words that seem to lead up to that. The words you've used seem to lead up to, here's the picture. The reason I remember him is that he's the fellow that killed the people in the theater. And the picture shows a strong guy. So James Holmes, the guy who killed the people in the theater, must have been a strong guy. Is that a train of thought that...
I'm not sure if strong is the word tied to it or not.
Okay. And again, there's a danger that I'm putting too much of my association into it. But the place that my mind goes with it is that people are not remembering James Holmes as a weak guy or a mediocre guy.
Right, yeah, I would say that's true.
Is there anything wrong with them remembering you as a mediocre guy or a weak guy?
Just that it wouldn't be memorable.
Okay. Go through just a couple more pages here. I asked you what it felt like to be arrested. The officers coming up and you surrendering and
Everything kind of went as expected.
okay. You had a tough time getting to the feelings associated with being arrested. You talked about the process, but not the feelings associated with being arrested.
I don't think there were any strong feelings.
Do you remember any particular strong feeling during that process? Any particular feeling, visceral or mental or emotional?
Just when I got out of the elevator in the police station, there it said child homicide section.
And we talked a bit about that and were you surprised that a child had been killed?
Yeah. I didn't think there were going to be any children there.
Did you feel sure there were going to be any children?
Like 80% sure.
You described child within the context of the folks that, in this context, you didn't mind killing, as somebody under 12.
Right.
It's a PG-13 movie. Seems to me that there are an awful lot of kids under 12 at PG-13 movies.
Not at midnight.
Not at midnight. Okay. Good point. And we talked about, even had there been no children, the fact that the people who were killed were likely, some of them, to be parents of children.
Right, I never considered that until you brought it up.
Wasn't a consideration. That was not relevant or not considered an indifferent factor.
Okay, yeah.
The two guys who questioned you, Detective Gumbiner and Detective Apple, you remember those names or not?
I remember Detective Apple, but was Gumbiner the FBI bomb specialist?
He was part of it, and I'm not remembering exactly what his title was, but he was with the FBI.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about your going to court. Once again, and you weren't sure, I think, the first time I asked this. Do you remember about when the first time you went to court was? About how many days after you were arrested or how many?
I don't remember, it was too long ago.
Okay. And at the time you said you didn't remember much about that event, about being in court.
Right.
Okay. about Dr. Woodcock seeing you. And we've talked a couple of times about the money that was mailed with the notebook. The several $100s and $20 bills that were burned at the edges. At one time you told me that you burned the money because you wouldn't have any use for it.
Right, once I got locked up or dead, I couldn't use any money.
But you burned it in a particular way.
So she would still be able to tell it was money.
And the communication to her was what with the money?
If I remember correctly, it was because I wouldn't have insurance, and it costed like $80 an hour for each session.
So what were you telling her with the money?
That money was a problem.
You didn't just send her the money, you sent it to her with the four corners of every bill burned off, and the bills carefully plastered onto sheets, as I recall.
No, actually, I just put it all in the back of the notebook. I think they might have done that in the sheets later.
Okay, so you didn't tape them down to sheets or glue them to sheets.
No, they were just loosely leafed.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, because I wasn't sure about that. What did the burning the edges mean, if anything, as part of the communication to Dr. Finn?
Just what I said before.
When you could have just sent the money. I don't
Right, but
understand.
then she would have misinterpreted, like, why is he paying me money?
Do you think she would have considered it a payment to receive that?
I don't know what she would have
I mean,
considered.
payment doesn't come to my mind, at least. The money means something. Psychiatrists always think money means lots of things.
Right.
But payment is not one of the ones I would have come up with. You burned the edges and sent her several $100s.
Right, I was trying to tell her that because I lost my job, I subsequently lost the insurance from it. So my illness was like at fault.
It sounds like you were mad. Almost saying, here, you greedy shrink. Here's the damn money.
Could be. I wasn't too angry though.
Explore that could be a little bit for me.
Well, it is kind of a mean thing to do to send her the notebook of all the information she didn't collect and burn the money, which is the reason why
Was there anything in it of, look what you did, Fenton?
a little bit, yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's kind of similar to like that emoticon I sent her when she messed up my prescription.
When you sent the emoticon, one of your impressions or one of your thoughts was that it might have frightened her.
Yeah, she misinterpreted it as me hitting her instead of it being a blow to the face that she couldn't remember my name or anything.
I'd suggest to you the possibility that at least part of the emoticon was an angry thing. And it wasn't it wouldn't be her misinterpreting, because part of the emoticon really had at least an irritation to it, because she inconvenienced you and she misunderstood you and didn't, this is just Reed talking, didn't value you enough to get the right name on the damn prescription.
Yeah, so it was a little bit hostile.
Hostile is a real civilized word. Angry,
Mean.
mad
It was a little bit mean.
We come back to the burned money. Any anger, meanness, look what you did, or boy, you'll think about this for a long time, Finn. In the money?
Yeah, I think it's analogous.
Can you talk to me about that emotion at the time?
Just that I was showing her what I was doing wrong. Or showing her what she did wrong.
Tell me what you might have been showing her that she was doing wrong.
Well, because of my illness, I could no longer go to the sessions because it was expensive.
Is that a truly good reason that you didn't go to the sessions, or is that not much of the reason that you didn't continue the sessions?
Well, the main reason was I was set on the mission. Kind of had an excuse to get out.
An excuse to get out of the sessions?
Yeah.
Because you actually knew at the time that there were a lot of ways that you could have continued the sessions, and
They'd offered to.
had offered, unlike the school, they had offered ways to continue the sessions. Is that accurate?
Yeah, for the summer.
I can't think of much else to ask you. What have I left out?
Oh, I have no idea. I think you've been pretty comprehensive.
Want to expand on anything that we've talked about?
No.
If there's anything that you want to communicate to me through your lawyers at any point, you're welcome to tell them, hey, tell this to Reed, and they will do that.
All right.
I suspect we won't talk again, at least not for some time. It's possible if I come back for a hearing or something that we would talk again. But I think I have everything that I need to do my task. Once again, I'll wish you what I wish everybody I see, and I hope whatever happens is fair.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right, I'm going to turn the lights on. The record should reflect that the prosecution just finished playing Exhibit P-TR-1011. Mr. Brockler, do you have some additional questions for Dr. Reed?
Your Honor, thank you.
Okay, Doctor, you may resume the witness stand. I remind you, Doctor, that you're still under oath. And members of the jury, I want to remind you again that it's important that you keep in mind that the defendant's statements and the video recording have been admitted only for a limited purpose. You may consider the defendant's statements and the video recording only as to the issues raised by his plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider them for any other purpose. Dr. Reed's statements and the video recording may only be considered for the limited purpose of allowing you to assess the reliability of his examination and to provide context to the statements made in the video recording by the defendant. You shall not consider any statements made by Dr. Reed and this video recording for any other purpose, including for the truth of the content of the statements or as evidence of what was said in the statements. And then finally, I remind you that Dr. Reed's testimony here in court has been admitted only for a limited purpose, you may consider his testimony here in court only as to the issues raised by the defendant's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You shall not consider this testimony for any other purpose. Everybody understand those instructions? And they're saying yes and nodding their head yes. All right, with those instructions in mind, Mr. Brockler, you may proceed with the rest of your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Reed, those last several segments that we saw took place weeks after the initial assessment and interviews down at the state hospital in Pueblo. Is that accurate?
Yes, about 4 weeks later.
Here's what I noticed, is that it seemed like you, and you even said this on the video, that you were going back and retouching things and circling around. I think you used other terminology like that. Why did you do that so much?
Sure. There are several reasons I wanted to come back. One is to ask more than once about different topics that might have been important, to see if the answers were consistent, to see if he'd thought about them or wanted to expand them or would expand them, to see if he would look any different or tell me any different things in a different environment, in the jail rather than the hospital. There were also things that I thought of that I hadn't asked or covered very well before, and I wanted to cover those. Wanted to be as thorough as possible.
Did you detect, and we saw some of it on the video, but did you detect a difference in how he presented down at the state hospital versus at the jail here?
I think there were some subtle differences. I probably won't remember all of them. He seemed a little bit more relaxed at the jail. I think you heard me mention on the tape that his pupils were not enlarged, at least that I noticed at the jail, at least at the time that I looked at it. Some of the style of my interview was different, which may have made him look a little bit different. For example, I got a little more philosophical. I did more of the talking. I kind of regret doing quite so much of the talking because the purpose is to have him talk. But as you know, he doesn't talk very much at some times. Let me stop there.
Okay. There's a couple things I want to touch on with you in that last couple segments that we saw that we had not quite heard before, and I want to ask you about them. One was the commitment that he makes to the value that he says that he receives from killing other human beings as abstract or theoretical. Why was it important for you to get into that with him?
I'm interested in whether his concept of gaining value or gaining a point for killing each other person was delusion set in his mind. That is, he believed it to be real and others didn't, or others wouldn't, versus the idea that it was an idea he had or a philosophy that he had that didn't rise to the level of a delusion or a deeper belief. I think that covers the why.
And based on the information that you got, what did you conclude?
I'm still confused. I think there are aspects of delusion in it, and I think there are delusional aspects to Mr. Holmes' psyche at the time that I saw him. He persisted in saying, even though I asked him several times, that the value or value points were not real. He never said that they were real, I don't believe, but that they were abstract or thoughts. I'm still not absolutely certain.
Does that cut towards the idea, though, that it's more of a belief, a philosophy, a value system, as opposed to a true delusion?
That's the question, and I would lean a little bit toward philosophy or value system, but I'm happy to entertain the thought that it's within a delusion. That is, it's not realistic, and he believed it and believes it firmly.
In just a little bit, I'll get you to talk more about some of the psychiatric diagnostic stuff, including the definition of delusion. We'll get there in a moment. There's something else there. Do you remember an exchange where the defendant says to you, killing people is considered evil? You respond, considered evil by, and he responds, everyone. Why was that psychiatrically significant to your analysis here?
I was interested in whether he thought he was evil. The word evil comes up in his mind or in the conversations and in my mind. His firm belief that other people would believe the killing's evil suggests to me an ability, a capability of I'm not sure how to put it and stay within the limitations of the court.
Yes, is what you're saying that it suggests a capacity to know right from wrong under the societal standards of morality?
It suggests that with respect to the societal standards of morality. Thank you. With regard to whether he thought himself evil, I think he wrestled with that and eventually said he didn't think himself evil.
For your purposes, Dr. Reed, is it the fact that he makes these comments, and in fact I'll refer you to one more. You addressed to him some statements he made to his girlfriend through a Google chat or a G-chat. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he responds that it's considered evil by society as you press him. Is that a similar statement to the ones that you got from him on killing people is considered evil by everyone?
It's a similar statement. I think that's why I started that chain of conversation in the interviews, and the earlier statement came prior to the shootings.
Now, does it change your opinion about his capacity to know right from wrong based on that societal standard of morality if he says, I know it, but I don't necessarily think me doing it is evil?
It does not change my opinion.
He also uses the phrase a couple times in there, he calls himself manic. Is that a psychiatrically significant term to use?
The term is psychiatrically significant. I think there's a question about whether he understood the term as he was applying it to himself.
How about the last thing I want to ask you about these last section of interview is you have a discussion with him about a guy sitting in the front row of the theater. And he talks about him being a guy that's smiling at him. And there's a conversation you have with him about whether he shoots him or not. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Tell us why that's psychiatrically significant.
First of all, it tells me that, at least according to him, he was paying attention. He was able to report that detail, assuming it's accurate. He was able to report that. He wasn't such an automaton, if you will, that he wasn't aware of lots of things around him. Second, I was interested in why he didn't shoot him, why he elected not to shoot him. And I think two things came up, at least two things came up. One is that by that time, according to him, he felt that he was done. And the second was, as he said several times, that would have been too personal.
He was able to make the choice not to shoot someone?
Yes, he was quite able to make the choice not to shoot.
All right, now I want to step back and just talk about a few other things that were touched upon throughout the videos, but we're going to segment them and talk about them in a little greater detail. One is, there is a conversation about Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, not just with you, but with other mental health providers in this case, and experts in this case, and even the notebook. So tell us a little bit about that in terms of when did those contacts with Dr. Fenton and Feinstein occur, and then let's talk about what you discovered from reviewing the discovery and talking with them that you found to be psychiatrically significant, okay?
Sure. If my memory serves, around early March of 2012, Mr. Holmes went to behavioral health or student health or something like that. He states because he felt anxiety, he felt anxious. There's one place in the record that suggests that Gargi told him to go or recommended that he go. But at any rate, he got there. He saw a social worker by the name of Ms. Roth. The social worker recognized what the social worker described as a person as anxious as anyone she'd ever seen, and also noted that he was talking about killing people. She then quickly referred him to a psychiatrist, Dr. Fenton, for further workup and evaluation. And I can go through the
We'll do that in a
chronology
minute.
some more if you like.
Let's step back. First off, what was the main complaint that it appears he went to go seek help for?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
He said, and the record reflects, that it was because he was feeling anxiety.
And that it impacted his public speaking?
Objection leading.
I'm not,
Hold on. It's a follow-up question to the last answer. I will allow it. Go ahead.
now that you mention it, I recall seeing the public speaking thing in the record. I'm not sure exactly what else he said.
There's something else significant about what he told Ms. Roth that you just told us, and that was that he'd had these thoughts of killing people. What do you describe
But
that?
I'm going to object to the manner or the form of the question. Counsel just said there's something significant, and he's testifying, so I object to the form of the question.
Sustain as to the form of the question.
Doctor, the statement that you said that he made to Ms. Roth that he had thoughts of killing people, is that significant?
Sure.
Tell us why.
First of all, it indicates a potential dangerousness that everyone who hears that should pay lots of attention to. It may have to do with psychiatric things, it may not, but it means very strongly that whoever is seeing him needs to evaluate carefully and perhaps protect others as well.
Now, in your experience in the 40 years you've been doing this, have you come across people who have expressed similar thoughts at different times?
Similar, not absolutely exactly.
Now, do those people, does everyone that expresses something like that, is that a firm indication that they intend to act on it and soon?
No, most do not act on it.
So what sort of...
Objection, relevance, Judge, at this point to what other people do.
Objection, and the objection is untimely, I should say. So the objection is overruled as untimely. It was made after the answer. Go ahead.
Now, Doctor, you said that after he sees Miss Roth, that she then refers him to a psychiatrist. Is that Dr. Fenton?
Yes.
Now tell us, what develops out of the times they spend together that was significant for you to consider?
Dr. Fenton did a psychiatric evaluation, an outpatient psychiatric evaluation, considered several diagnoses, treated him for anxiety, paid attention to his statements about wanting to kill others, and documented that she heard those statements and, in her judgment, he was not going to act on them. They saw each other 4 times, I believe. As I mentioned, she prescribed some medication primarily associated with alleviating anxiety. At some point, she believed it was important to have another psychiatrist come into the sessions, asked Mr. Holmes' permission, and Dr. Feinstein joined them, and the 3 of them met for 2 more sessions. All this happened, I believe, over the course of mid-March to June 11, 2012.
During that period of time leading up to June 11th, 2012, was there any other documented or even told to you by Fenton and Feinstein, any other additional information provided by the defendant about whether he was planning to carry out these thoughts?
So far as I know from the notes and from the conversation with them, there were continuing comments about the thoughts, but nothing about specific victims, nothing about specific plans.
And those were asked?
Yes, those were asked.
Did they ever, during this time that they see him, does it ever document that he appeared suicidal?
They inquired about suicidality or suicide risk, and they came to the conclusion that he did not appear suicidal.
How about even depressed?
They assessed for depression. I don't recall exactly what they wrote down. I don't believe there was ever any diagnosis of a depressive illness. I don't remember whether depression was particularly mentioned in a list of symptoms or not.
Was there any indication as to whether his physical appearance changed at all, or hygiene at all, during the period that they met with him?
I remember one session, I think it was late in the 6 sessions, in which I think Dr. Feinstein said, either to me or in the record or both, that he smelled as if he didn't have good hygiene.
Was that the only reference to that you saw?
As I sit here, I don't recall any other. There may be one.
Do they ask him about, or is there anything in the record that suggests that he had told them that he was seeing any visual hallucinations?
No, he did not tell them about any visual hallucinations.
Shadows?
No.
Flickerings?
No.
Flashes?
No.
How about voices?
No, and I'm quite sure they asked about voices, and apparently he denied it. Now I'm saying what was in the record and what they told me, and hoping that that's representative of exactly what happened in the sessions.
How about any discussions where he gives information to them about human capital or anything like that?
I don't recall any such comment in the record or their conversation with me.
So you have this, it sounds like 4 sessions with Dr. Fenton plus 2 with Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein. And you have these meetings with the defendant that take place over this period of time prior to the shooting. And given the information that was provided, was this the basis for some of the questions you asked the defendant about how forthcoming he was with Fenton and Feinstein?
It was part of the basis, yes.
And what did he tell you about all that?
He told me that he hid some things. He told me that he omitted some things. Told me that he believed or realized that if he told them more, they might or were likely to have him locked up, his phrase, which he didn't want.
How does that impact your assessment of his capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality?
It suggests that he believed other people would think something wrong or at least dangerous was likely to occur, was imminently going to occur if he told them.
You said the last meeting that he had with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein was on June 11th. Is there anything in the record or through your conversations with Dr. Fenton and Feinstein where the defendant reveals to them that he has been amassing an arsenal of weapons?
Nothing at all.
Does he tell them anything about specific plans or targets on that June 11th, 2012 date?
No, he, so far as the record indicates or they indicate, he's kept all that from them.
He does share with them some other information about what his future plans may be. Is that true?
That's fair to say, sure.
What does he share with them?
He shares with them that he has failed his prelim exams, that he's dropping or dropped out of school, that he is going to go get a job. He may, I'm just not remembering, say that he was going to apply for unemployment, that dropping out of school or losing his job, so to speak, as a graduate student would cause a loss of the insurance. I think he said something about sticking around Denver rather than going back to San Diego or something like that.
When he does that, does he reference his lease?
I know that he signed a lease that would extend for some time. I'm not recalling whether or not he said that on that day.
Okay, and you were about to say something else before I kind of rudely stepped on your words there. Sorry.
Roughly halfway through the session I think was designed to last about 45 minutes. About 20 minutes into the session, he, according to them, abruptly said, I have to go now. I have to talk with my advisor or talk with somebody about dropping out, and without any ceremony left.
Now, you actually addressed this in this last portion of the videoed assessment where you ask him about how and why he ended up stopping and seeing Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, and you referenced the money portion based on what he'd sent in the notebook. Do you remember that?
I remember we talked about that topic.
Yeah. Now, what does he tell you about the statements that he makes to Drs. Fenton and Feinstein about, hey, I'm going to stop seeing you because I'm losing my insurance?
It's a bit confused, what he told me. He referred to, I wasn't going to have any money. My insurance was, or I had money, but my insurance had dropped. He, somewhere along the line, Fenton and Feinstein realized that he had some savings he could have used. They offered or invited him, and he tells us in the video, they invited him to continue. They said, essentially they said, we'll find a way to see you. And what he said in the video here that we just saw was, I didn't continue because I was going to be busy with my mission.
And doesn't he also say that he needed an excuse to get out of the session?
He did use the word excuse, yeah.
Now, Dr. Fenton, does she also, after this, acquire some additional information that you could consider based on phone calls to the defendant's mother and the head of his department, someone named Sukumar, last name begins with a V?
Yes.
What did you learn from that?
I'm going to object on the basis of double hearsay.
Would counsel approach, please? All right, the question has been withdrawn. Mr. Bruckler, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, you spent portions of this videotaped assessment several different times talking about the notebook that the defendant generated. Do you recall that?
Yes.
I want to talk to you about certain parts of it. You went over it. Was it almost line by line, or did you just pick certain portions that you thought were most relevant to your assessment?
I think it was close to line by line. I may have missed certain things. I just don't recall specifically.
Look, there are portions that we even heard in opening statement that were read. How do you characterize the things that were written, not related to the schematics, not related to the planning to commit the murders? I'm talking about the other things that were assessed. And I'll break it down in this way. There's a portion where he seems to engage in some philosophical writings. Do you recall that?
Depending on what you mean by philosophical, yes.
I use that term.
Okay.
There are writings that are unrelated to what ails him and unrelated to the schematics about how he was going to carry out this crime and unrelated to him assessing which way he wanted to commit murder. Do you recall that?
Yes, there are.
Can you describe for us what the significance of those portions were to you?
If I might have a copy of it, I've got one in my bag back there, or just so that I can be more accurate.
You may approach the witness, Your Honor.
You may.
Sir, I don't have any writing in this, and I'm handing you just a generic copy of this. I don't intend to admit this into evidence, but take a look at that, and if it looks like the notebook, let us know. And then if you're referring to a specific page, would you tell us which page you're referring to?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
I believe the question had to do with philosophical things.
That was my word, but don't use
Okay.
my word, dude.
Okay. The first thing I see, oops. The first thing I see in the very beginning, and it doesn't have, it's a little confusing to look at.
Well, and Doctor, let me just make a record of that too. The copy that you're looking at has 2 per page photographs, and then as you go past that, each page is full size.
Okay.
Does that help at all?
That's fine.
Okay.
One of the very first pages, titled Questions, simply says, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of death? And then there's a sort of a logo that I think folks may be familiar with by now, the circle with a 1 and an infinity in it, which he calls the ultraception.
Judge, I hate to interrupt, but can I have the page, please?
Sure, it's before the pages are even numbered. I believe it's the first page of the book.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, tell us, what significance, if anything, does that have for you?
Simply that he's asking a question that lots of people ask.
Not unusual.
No, and the ultraception kind of logo is personal to him. It doesn't have any particular significance to me as a drawing. He talks about it later, what it means to him.
Okay. Can you go to the next page then
Sure.
and tell us which page number it is?
Page 27, and it jumps to page 27. No, I'm sorry, the page before 27 that's not numbered is a dedication to Goober, Chrissy, Bobo, love yous. Those are his family members.
Why is that significant, if at all?
It's simply a little unusual. I don't know who, when this was written, who it was intended to be read by, if anyone. Sometimes one journal or something isn't intended to be read by anyone. But it does say to his family members, and it's interesting, but I don't know what it means.
Well, let me ask you, does it affect the way you assess and look at this thing if it appears that it's written for someone else?
Objection, Judge. Calls for speculation. The witness has said that he can't say what that means.
Overruled. It's a different question than whether he knows what it means.
When something's written for someone else, it implies to me that the writing changes a little or a lot because it's no longer completely private. It's what you want that person to see, just as when you take a photograph that other people are expected to see, you likely take a different photograph than you would if you were taking it just for yourself to look at.
Does that consideration impact sort of how you go through and view some of the stuff that's written in there?
Oh, sort of. I don't want to make too big a deal of it.
Sure. After that page, which I think it begins not on page 27. Dan, can I touch? How about the page after 27, which you would think is 28, but I don't see a 28 on it. Do you see?
It's not numbered, but it's just before 29. Oh, it is numbered 28, I beg your pardon.
Okay. Now, as we go through those things, how do those things impact you as you begin to add this to your assessment of the defendant prior to the shooting?
Without reading each one out loud, which you may or may not want me to do,
I do not.
they appear to be thoughts about life and the world and the universe and people, justice. They appear to be thoughts that he's thinking about and documenting the thoughts that he's having.
Okay.
Rather neatly, I might say.
Now, these things, do some of them, do they strike you as philosophical or something else?
They strike me as philosophical. They're a little bit odd out of context. I don't know what he was thinking at the time. If you just read a sentence or a page, some of them look somewhat odd because I don't know the context. Perhaps they are odd, and there's an inference that they represent either an anguish in thinking about these things, concern about thinking about them, or perhaps a mental illness at various places.
Doctor, I know you've had the opportunity to review his performance in college and in undergrad. Is that fair?
Yes.
And did you see his transcripts?
Yes.
Did you ever, as part of your assessment, I didn't hear it on the videos, but as part of your global assessment, ever go back to see what philosophies were covered in the philosophy of life class he got an A in at the end of his undergraduate degree?
No, I never looked at that, never asked about it.
The schematics, as we move through this, right before them, I'm going to get you the page. 48. Judge, with the court's permission, could I publish that page?
Yes?
Ma'am, it's 341-48. I don't know what that means. Okay, this page right here, take a look at that, doctor. I want to ask you, how does this impact, if at all, your assessment of the defendant's capacity to form the intent to murder after deliberation and to act knowingly, all those things?
The page by itself could just be thoughts. In context, it suggests an ability to plan and think about a crime, think about pros and cons. Some of the items appear to be the idea comes up and then the idea is discarded. That's the way I think about it.
Now, as we move through the following pages, and you do not have to put these up, ma'am, you can take them down, 49, 50, 51, 52. And these are all the schematics of the different theaters with the pros and cons and whatnot. How do you assess those?
Now it becomes more specific. It appears to reflect more realistic planning, or at least more realistic thoughts about planning. It still doesn't indicate that something's going to happen taken out of context. But in context, and let me just,
And ma'am, would you put up 52 for us, please?
it appears to reflect a lot of trouble gone into both the thought and apparently the actual visiting or measuring of things going into planning the shootings.
Now, I've got the top part of page 52 blown up here on the screen. Take a look at that if you would, Doctor. Is there anything about the fact that he's measuring where law enforcement or military would be and ETA 3 minutes? Does that impact your assessment?
It suggests that he estimates how long it will take for the police to get there, and suggests that that there are thoughts about whether or how long it might take for him to be caught or stopped.
Now, again, in this particular workbook, notebook, journal, there's a couple pages where he goes through a rather detailed assessment, not only of what he believes ails him,
Judge,
but that...
I'm going to object at this point to the form of the question. This is facts, not in evidence.
Sustained. Rephrase your question.
Ma'am, would you put up page 32? (32, 33, 34, 35, and the top of 36. Do you see those, Doctor?
I have them here, yes.
Yeah, how would you describe those pages?
Through 35, it's a little bit dim here, but through 35, he appears to be describing things that he is feeling or believes are characteristics of his that are concerning, that are disturbing to him.
Now,
Symptoms, things like that.
based on what we're seeing up here on the top of 32, do these appear to be just a one-word list, or is he going into some description of them?
He goes into considerable description.
Now, over those pages, is there anywhere in there that the defendant says that he's seeing shadows?
I looked for that before, so I can say no.
That he's hearing voices?
No.
Anything that juggles?
No.
Take that down there. I want to talk to you now about, we've talked a lot about capacity, but one of the things that you and the other experts do is try to come up with a diagnosis. Is that fair?
Yes.
Tell us about what a diagnosis means and what's it based on when you try to come up with one.
A diagnosis, generally speaking, is a concise description of a known regular group of symptoms or signs, speaking medically.
Does the diagnosis itself, whatever the name it is that it's given, does that tell us about how whatever that is impacts someone's function?
If you're speaking of psychiatric diagnosis, the answer is usually not, but sometimes it is.
Now, in this particular case, and we'll talk about how you got there, you have concluded that the defendant has a serious mental illness. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell us, when the term serious or significant or any other synonym is used with mental illness, what is it saying?
Okay. First of all, serious mental illness to me is not quite synonymous with significant mental illness. Serious means a measurable effect on function or feeling or ability to get along in the world or comfort, things like that. That seems to me to go beyond the words simply significant.
So serious goes beyond the word significant, is that what you're saying?
To me.
Okay. So in this particular case, without getting to the names that may apply, what did you determine the mental illness, how it impacted or interfered with the defendant's function?
It caused him to have considerable difficulty communicating with some other people in particularly social ways. Not all people, but most. Caused him to misperceive sometimes what people around him thought or meant when they were interacting with him. Caused him to be very nervous, or I'll say anxious, in some or many social situations. Caused him in some ways to think oddly and to behave oddly. Interfered with his ability to reach his maximum potential in school or work. Interfered with his ability to form close or intimate relationships. I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list, but those are the things I think of.
The things you're describing, are most of them related to his ability to function closely, socially, that sort of thing, and communicate socially?
A lot of them are. I don't know that it's most of them, because some of them have to do with the way he views the world and how comfortable he is with the world, not just the way he interacts with the world.
Okay. Is there a book, a manual, a treatise, a something that you and other psychiatrists use to try to diagnose someone in terms of mental illness?
There are several, but the one that's most common and the one that I think you're referring to is something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, published by the American Psychiatric Association.
Okay, now that means there must be 4 other prior editions?
Actually, there are 5 prior editions, but that's correct. There were 2 editions of the 4th edition. There were 2 versions of the 4th edition.
Now, and how do they change over time?
There's been an effort since before 1950, I think, to make the diagnoses more valid, that is, more scientifically correct, and more reliable, that is, so that one clinician using the same criteria will come to the same diagnosis or close to the same diagnosis as another clinician given the same set of symptoms. That process and those diagnostic criteria and other things in the book been arrived at by task forces and committees of hundreds of psychiatrists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and then reviewed in the field by thousands of psychiatrists, psychologists, and neuroscientists.
And we can call it the DSM-5 for short?
That's the better way to say it.
Is the DSM-5 a book that is relied upon by psychiatrists in your field?
Yes.
Do you rely upon the DSM-5?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Sir, I'm handing you this purple book. Do you recognize what that book is? And ignore the tabs.
Yes, this is the DSM-5. I will say that I didn't know until you started mentioning it in this trial that it's purple. I thought it was blue.
Oh, that could be me.
And I don't mean to make light of things. This is a serious time. Okay.
Well, that's all right. I have a color impairment. So anyway, that book, whatever that book's color is, that's the DSM-5?
Yes.
Okay. Now, is there some cautionary word from this manual and the people that put it out about using these diagnostic criteria that we're about to talk about in a setting exactly like this one?
Objection, Judge. The leading. May I approach?
You may. All right, the objection is overruled. You may proceed.
Doctor, your answer to that question?
Yes, there is. For the past at least 3 editions of the DSM, there's been what the APA calls a cautionary statement with regard to the use of the DSM in non-clinical settings, particularly administrative and particularly forensic ones.
Now, is this actually a cautionary statement about the entire book?
I believe it is. I'm quite familiar with the statement, yeah.
Who is the book written for?
Clinicians.
That's not us in here.
That's not most of us in here so far as I know.
Okay. What I'd like to ask you to do is there are 2 paragraphs that address this here. Could you please read for us paragraph number 1, and then I'm going to ask you to read paragraph number 3.
Sure. The title is Cautionary Statement for Forensic Use of DSM-5. Although the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria and text are primarily designed to assist clinicians in conducting clinical assessment, case formulation, and treatment planning, DSM-5 is also used as a reference for the courts and attorneys in assessing the forensic consequences of mental disorders. As a result, it is important to note that the definition of mental disorder included in the DSM-5 was developed to meet the needs of clinicians, public health professionals, and research investigators, rather than all of the technical needs of the courts and legal professionals. It is also important to note that DSM-5 does not provide treatment guidelines for any given disorder.
Now, paragraph number 3 begins, however.
However, the use of DSM-5 should be informed by an awareness of the risks and limitations of its use in forensic settings. When DSM-5 categories, criteria, and textual descriptions are employed for forensic purposes, there is a risk that diagnostic information will be misused or misunderstood. Those dangers arise because of the imperfect fit between the questions of ultimate concern to the law and the information contained in a clinical diagnosis. In most situations, the clinical diagnosis of a DSM-5 mental disorder, such as intellectual disability, intellectual developmental disorder, schizophrenia, major neurocognitive disorder, gambling disorder, or pedophilic disorder, does not imply that an individual with such a condition meets legal criteria for the presence of a mental disorder or a specified legal standard, e.g. for competence, criminal responsibility, or disability. For the latter, additional information is usually required beyond that contained in the DSM-5 diagnosis, which might include information about the individual's functional impairments and how these impairments affect the particular abilities in question. It is precisely because impairments, abilities, and disabilities vary widely within each diagnostic category that assignment of a particular diagnosis does not imply a specific level of impairment or disability.
Thank you, Doctor. What is that telling us in your expert opinion?
2 things. That when diagnoses and diagnostic criteria such as those in DSM-5 are used in a courtroom setting, that needs to be accompanied by some sort of explanation from a clinical source. The second, and I think important here, is that diagnoses, and they mention schizophrenia particularly, but it applies to virtually all the diagnoses, do not necessarily bear on the questions that a court asks, such as questions related to criminal responsibility, particularly when the question has to do, when the legal question has to do with how the person functioned at some particular time, rather than simply whether or not the diagnosis existed.
Or whether they had the capacity to form intent, knowing, or whether they had the capacity to know right from wrong based on societal standards of morality?
Objection leading.
Overruled.
In this case, those are the questions, and that would apply.
Would you please do us the favor anyway of talking us through how you came to your conclusion about what diagnoses may apply here to the defendant and why?
First, I looked at the record, particularly regarding the defendant. I looked at the record of his evaluations, of his treatment, of his various psychological testing and other testing, records of interviews with him, records of how other people view him or have experienced him, particularly prior to the shootings. Then I spent a fair amount of time with him talking about lots of things, and the process of talking with him was also creating, in my mind, something called a mental status examination, which helps me understand how he is mentally functioning as I'm talking with him. Then I take the things that I find, and I think this is true of other people like me too, not just me. I take the things that I find, and I think in my mind, does this fit any psychiatric diagnosis? And if so, which diagnosis or diagnoses may it fit? Then I go to the DSM-5 and other references as well, generally. But ultimately, I'll go to the DSM-5 and see which of the criteria appear to apply to the defendant and all those characteristics. The fit is never, or almost never, exact, but the criteria are set out with a little bit of room. For example, many of the diagnoses might list for one part of a diagnosis 5 or 6 or 7 different things, and if he has 4 or 5 or 6 of them, then that's a mark toward the diagnosis.
Okay, in this particular case, doctor, tell us what conclusion you came to and why.
My conclusion is that he meets the criteria for something called schizotypal personality, S-C-H-I-Z-O-T-Y-P-A-L, personality, and may well meet the criteria for something called delusional disorder. I was aware as I did that he comes close to meeting criteria for some other similar disorders, but the one I think is most applicable and the one for which he does meet the criteria, in my opinion, is schizotypal personality.
You said delusional disorder, and we've heard you refer to a delusion. What is the psychiatric definition of a delusion?
A delusion is a fixed belief that is also false, a fixed false belief. And in addition, it's a belief that is generally not held by others in a society. That allows us to say that religions are not a delusion, whether somebody thinks they're false or not false. But one may be delusional within a religion if his or her belief is way outside those bounds. The example I usually give is, for example, a charismatic Christian may well not be delusional, but if he or she truly believes that he's Jesus Christ, he probably is, very probably is delusional even within that religious belief.
Now, in this particular case, you concluded, it sounds like, that the defendant has at least one delusion. Did you conclude one or more than one?
The defendant has some, I'm pretty well convinced, he has some experiences of delusion. Whether he meets the criteria for delusional disorder or not is another matter, but within schizotypal personality disorder, there's room for one of the criteria that one may meet, doesn't have to, is that delusions exist. And I believe that at various times he has had them and probably has some chronic delusions as well.
Like what?
Some of the more temporary ones had to do with the idea that that he expressed and told Dr. Fenton about, that Dr. Fenton had purposely locked him out of the office one day, and that a box sitting near Dr. Fenton's desk had some meaning that the box didn't really have. That was apparently short-lived and limited. The larger one, a larger one, the one that stands out, is the delusion that if he kills someone, he somehow takes on something representative of their value, even though it's arbitrary to him. And once again, I'm a little confused about that. Both Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein talked about him being paranoid, which has an implication of delusion in it. And I think I'm not doing a very good job of explaining.
Well, let me just ask you, you said you're confused about whether or not this belief that he has this increased value from killing people is a delusion. Well, I want to ask you, based on the definition that you...
Objection, misstates the testimony. Object to the form of the question.
Overruled.
I want to ask, go ahead, sir. If you need to clarify something I said, please do that.
Okay. If I may, I'm going to... Okay. I would not argue with somebody that, with a professional, with a clinician, that says this is a delusional characteristic. He doesn't really have the value of other people, and that's that. He believes in it. It's a fixed and false belief that nobody else holds. As I kind of philosophically look at it, is it merely a philosophical belief? I leave room for somebody else who might say that it is. I lean toward the idea of delusion. I'm sorry that I'm so vague about it.
So, well, let me ask you then to clarify. What are some classic delusions that might help us understand what the delusion is based on that definition you gave?
Some of the common ones, the persecutory ones, are somebody's out to get me, and it's not just because they're really out to get me. You heard him talk about the possibility that police cars parked around his apartment from time to time were there watching him. When he thought about it a little bit, he sort of explained that maybe they weren't really there to watch him. He considered the possibility that they weren't watching him. That moves us a little away from delusion. The idea that another example would be somebody who thinks he or she is someone grandiose. I'm the King of England. I'm the Queen of the Desert. And with a true belief in that, not I feel like the Queen of the Desert. I am the Queen of the Desert, and nothing you can say will dissuade me of that. There are other examples, but that's the idea.
Can I ask you some hypotheticals? Sure. Somebody thinks that the person that they're killing is not a person, but instead is a demon inhabiting a person's body. Would that be a delusion?
Truly believed, that would be a delusion, and that would be a relevant one for a criminal court in some cases.
How about someone who believes if they don't engage in some conduct that California will break off the U.S. and slip into the ocean?
That would be a delusion.
Now, do all those things have as a common characteristic, including the ones you gave, they are either factually accurate or they are factually inaccurate? Is that fair?
If I'm understanding you, the clearness that they're factually inaccurate,
like that person's not really the queen of whatever.
Is important. That's important to the concept, sure.
So I want to ask you, regarding this potential delusion about value, the defendant, did he tell you it was a factual value or abstract and theoretical?
And
Judge, that misconstrues the testimony.
He's asking the question, overruled.
And that's partly my point. When I asked him, is this something real or something that you've made up for yourself, he really wouldn't say it was real. He said, in effect, I made it up for myself. It came from inside me. It's arbitrary. And that's where I have a little bit of problem with it. I don't mean to be making this more complicated than it is. It may be arguing about the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah, well, I'm going to continue to ask you a couple more angel-related questions then, okay? If this belief, as has been described, I'm asking you a hypothetical now, if a belief is one that is theoretical, is abstract, is one that has no physical component to it, no disprovable physical component to it, how is it that anybody can say whether it is a false belief?
I'm afraid I don't buy the premise.
Well, tell me.
There are lots of things that we can't test that we're still pretty sure are false beliefs, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, let me try to make it simpler. I love Justin Bieber. I think Justin Bieber's the greatest performer on the planet Earth, okay? Let's say that. And no matter what you do, you can show me Beatles, Elvis, country music, whatever it is, I am never going to be dissuaded from that because I value him as the greatest performer ever in the history of music. Now, if everybody on the planet Earth voted and said, we disagree with that, Bieber fever is over, that's it, he's awful, is that a delusion on my part? Or is that just a value, a subjective value that I've chosen to place on something?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Go ahead, sir.
It sounds like a value you have chosen, and you use the word subjective. And interestingly, I believe Mr. Holmes used the term subjective as well in the video. Now, he may have been using the word subjective in another context.
Yeah, I'd object to that as a misstatement of the evidence.
The jury will rely on its own memory of what's on the videotape. All right.
Go ahead, sir.
You're not delusional just because you think Justin Bieber is the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Well, then, can you help me understand how can the defendant be considered delusional because he has decided for himself, by himself, that he gets some indescribable increase of value by killing other people?
It depends on the clinical judgment, and I've kind of already said that there are ways to interpret it as something other than a delusion and ways I wouldn't argue with to interpret it as a delusion. Either way, we're left with the defendant as he is, whatever we call it.
Understood. Is believing or is concluding that there's a delusion one of the diagnostic criteria for schizotypal personality disorder?
It's one of the criteria, but it need not be met. It's one of the possible criteria. You only have to meet 5 of 8 in that particular section.
In this particular case, tell us which ones you think apply to the defendant for your diagnosis. And doctor, I see you referring to something. Can we presume that's your report?
Yes, I'm referring to my report.
Do us a favor. When you're referring to your report, would you tell us that and
Surely.
tell us what page you're looking at?
Sure. I'm looking at pages 5 and 6 of my report, and on those pages I quote heavily or summarize from the DSM-5. Within one portion of the way one diagnoses schizotypal personality, there are 9 things to consider, and the person needs to have 5 in order to pass that particular hurdle getting to the diagnosis. And let me point out that the diagnoses are not rote cookbook things. They involve clinical judgment and clinical wrestling sometimes, just as we've been talking about whether such and such is a delusion or not. One of the things that he has, in my opinion, is odd beliefs or magical thinking that influence his behavior and are inconsistent with cultural norms. Part of that odd belief or magical thinking, in my view, would be the thinking that if he kills someone, he gets something from that. Another is unusual perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions. We've talked about Mr. Holmes describing seeing flickers or shadows. There are points in the notebook in which he describes, and he described to me, wondering if his nose is a certain way, wondering if some other body parts are working or not working, that I think are likely to be illusions about his body. And certainly the other perceptual experience would be the shadows or the flickers, assuming that they're as he's describing them. A third one is odd thinking and speech, such as, but not necessarily limited to, vagueness, circumstantiality that's wandering around before you come back to the point, speaking in metaphors, over-elaborating stereotyped speech. The way he has talked with me and with some other people it reflects an odd way of speaking, and I believe reflects an odd way of thinking as well. The fourth one, suspiciousness or paranoid thinking. I think that's present to at least some extent at some times, and we've already talked about, and I'm talking about before the shootings, we've already talked about him thinking that Dr. Fenton's box had a particular significance, or Dr. Feinstein's cast had a particular significance for him. The fifth one, sixth one on the list, but the fifth one that he has, in my opinion, inappropriate or constricted, limited affect. Affect means your facial expression or your emotions as they come through your face. We see in Mr. Holmes a somewhat flattened or blunted affect. Some affects I've simply not seen. Significant anger, significant sadness, things like that. I've seen a little humor. But mostly his face doesn't change much as he talks with us or to anyone that I know of. Another one, I think it would be number 5, maybe the number, whichever number it is. Odd, eccentric, or peculiar appearance or behavior. The way he behaves with people, I believe, is a bit odd, and I would put a check mark there. Some people wouldn't. They would say he's not particularly eccentric. He doesn't wear green clothes all the time or something like that. If we think about his dyeing his hair red, I don't think that's a big deal in this particular context. The next one, lack of close friends or confidants other than close family. He has some friends or has had some friends. They're not that close, and when they get close, he has difficulty with that. He has had some close friends, but there's an overall lack of them and difficulty with those interactions. And finally, the last one on the list is excessive social anxiety that doesn't diminish with familiarity and tends to be associated with paranoid fears rather than negative judgments about himself. That may or may not be present, since when he becomes more familiar with people, the anxiety tends to decrease. It's a little hard to tell. He was with me for a fair amount of time, and the anxiety may have decreased a little bit. I'm not sure whether that one applies to him or not, particularly because if it's there, well, let me go back on that. Tending to be associated with paranoid fears rather than negative judgments about oneself. It may be there, it may not. Any way you cut it, I believe there are at least 5 of those 9 things that are clearly present in Mr. Holmes. Now, there's another part of the diagnosis, and that is that he doesn't meet, in order to make the diagnosis, he cannot meet criteria for certain more serious illnesses, such as schizophrenia. If he is diagnosed accurately with schizophrenia, then in my book, he doesn't have schizotypal personality. Maybe he had it before and it became schizophrenia. The issue there is, does he meet the initial criteria for schizophrenia? I believe he does not meet those, so I would, or did not prior to the shootings, so I would leave him here. I'm aware that some other people believe he does meet those criteria. I don't have an enormous argument with him, except that, and maybe this is going too far with your question, except that I don't believe he had a significant psychotic break prior to the shootings. That is a significant and lasting break with reality.
Your Honor, I think you're about to ask me if I needed 15 minutes more, and I do, and then I'll be done.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break then. All right, members of the jury, let's go ahead and take our afternoon break. Please keep in mind all of the advisements that I've been giving you with respect to your conduct. They all apply during the break. I'll see you back here in 20 minutes. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Now, let's go ahead and take our afternoon break. I'll see you folks back here in 20 minutes. The court will be in recess.
Please rise.